All right, we're a minute past 12 and a good few people have come in already, so we'll go through the housekeeping and various other things. First of all, we're operating in webinar mode, which means that you can see the presenters and they can read your questions, but they cannot see you. And the only way you can communicate with the presenters is through Q&A or through the chat. So if you've got questions, it would be good to put them in the Q&A, and we will get through as many as we can. Now, just before we kick off, I'd like to do a welcome to country, and Farmers for Climate Action acknowledges the traditional owners of the land on which we're broadcasting today. We respect their past and present leaders and emerging leaders. In my case, I'm broadcasting from Wiradjuri land in southern New South Wales. And our other presenters are coming from Melbourne and Brisbane, and unfortunately I don't know what traditional land that is, but they might say. So we'll move right along. You can obviously see on the screen our two presenters and myself. So we have Stephanie Gersekowski and Ross De Rango, and we thank them for coming here today. I think that's all we need to do. I'm not sure how many VIPs we might have in the audience, but I guess somebody will point that out to me if we see something. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Stephanie. She's going to give the first talk on where she sees the role of EVs in farming. Stephanie is John Deere's Production and Systems Manager for New South Wales, for Australia and New Zealand. And she grew up on a beef and grain property in Queensland, Darling Downs, which inspired her to pursue a career in agriculture. Stephanie joined John Deere in 2015, where she has supported John Deere's dealers, customers with the ag industry across various marketing and sales roles. In Stephanie's current role as Production Systems Manager, she is responsible for supporting the horticultural and dairy industry and livestock segments across Australia and New Zealand through delivering products and solutions to help meet the customer's needs. And she will go into more of that detail now. So I hand over to Stephanie. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. I just wanted to check you can see my screen and hear me okay.
Yes, it looks like people can see your screen but can't see you. But anyway,
okay,
we'll keep going.
All right. No, that's all right. So thank you for that welcome. As Peter mentioned, my name is Steph Gersekowski and I am the Production Systems Manager for John Deere across Australia and New Zealand. As Peter called out, my team and I are responsible for the strategic and tactical marketing activities that support our dairy and livestock segments and our horticulture segments. So today I'm going to be sharing with you a little bit around John Deere's electrification strategy. And there's a couple of points here that I wanted to cover off on with you. So in terms of our electrification strategy, first and foremost, it is driven by customer value, and that's something that I'm going to circle back to quite a bit throughout the slides that I have to share with you all. In addition to that, since we announced our electrification strategy publicly last year, we've received a lot of positive feedback, but also a lot of questions. So I want to try and tackle some of those at least at a high level and just be transparent with how we're tracking and where we're at with some of those points. So the first one there on the screen is the power management piece. And we acknowledge that this presents both a challenge and an opportunity for us as a business to overcome and deliver on as part of our electrification strategy. And the third point there, and it's a really important one with our electrification strategy, and that is our intent to proceed with open communication and collaboration, not only with our customers and test cooperators, but also with utility partners, because we understand that that is critical to the success of this project. So before I go into the specifics around our electrification strategy and what we'll deliver as part of that strategy, I just wanted to spend a couple of moments touching on, I guess, the broader enterprise strategy that is underpinning the project around electrification. So back at the start of last year, John Deere announced our LEAP ambitions, and these are a set of really specific targets that will direct our company's position and strategy as we move into 2026 and 2030. The LEAP ambitions form part of our larger overarching smart industrial strategy that was announced back in 2020. So under our LEAP ambitions, we believe that Deere is specifically positioned to deliver both economic and sustainable value to you as our customer. And we're going to do that for you by delivering advanced technology and solutions. And our electrification strategy falls part of that. Now, as soon as we start talking sustainable outcomes and sustainability, I know a lot of people can roll their eyes and really question, where is the meat behind those kind of statements? So I just wanted to bring up on the screen here 4 of our specific targets in terms of our sustainable outcomes. So the first one there is our target to enhance our ag customer outcomes by 2030. So specifically, this goal is around improving nitrogen use for our customers in terms of efficiency by 20%. And we also have a goal to help reduce our customers' CO2e emissions by 15% by 2030. In terms of Deere's targets, we have a goal to reduce our own operational CO2e emissions by 50% by 2030, as well as reduce our waste intensity and freshwater usage by 15% and 10% respectively. We also have a goal to achieve 95% product circularity within our manufacturing facilities by 2030. As well as always, safety will be front of mind, with a goal to reduce our reportable incident rate by 15% by 2026. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of flavour around the specific targets and timelines that we're setting to achieve these goals, and just why electrification is an important part of our strategy moving forward. When I talk about John Deere's electrification strategy, I'm not talking about one product being developed in isolation. Last year, we announced our intent to deliver a range of electrification solutions across our portfolios. So this includes an autonomous battery-powered electric ag tractor, and that's what most of my presentation will be focused on today. But I did want to give you visibility that we'll also be delivering an electric solution in each of our turf and compact utility product families, as well as over 20 electric and hybrid electric models in our construction and forestry portfolios as well. So before I go in any further on the battery electric tractor that we're developing for market by 2026, I just wanted to set, I guess, a little bit of context about what type of customers in the industry we're really targeting this machine towards. So this tractor is specifically going to be targeted to the horticulture segment initially, and specifically we're looking at almond and viticulture producers. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about why we're starting there, but I have no doubt as we talk through some of the opportunities and benefits that battery electric technology can provide, that whether you're from a livestock or broadacre application, you'll start to see some synergies there and some opportunities that no doubt will come towards you as we start to get closer to launch date in terms of your opportunity to adopt this technology as well. So at the start of the presentation, I spoke about that the electrification strategy is driven first and foremost by customer value. So I just wanted to briefly touch on the fact that we do acknowledge that the work that you're doing, and this is applicable across all ag segments, is definitely becoming more and more difficult. We have been facing increasing challenges around labour shortages, which was only increased during the pandemic with the difficulty of accessing both skilled and unskilled labour. We're seeing more and more pressure in terms of time constraints, specifically making sure that you have enough time to get your jobs done while the weather conditions are right. And that leads me straight into the next point. We are seeing more and more increasing adverse weather events that we hadn't previously seen historically recorded before. On top of all of those challenges, we're seeing escalating customer demands. Now, while the battery electric tractor is initially targeted to Hort, and traceability is a very big topic in that space at the moment, I also understand that traceability is touching every single ag industry segment at the moment as well. And then, of course, there's those upcoming challenges that we just don't know yet. COVID is a perfect example that I don't think many people predicted at the end of 2019 when we're all busy looking at the devastating impact of bushfires. So I want to spend a little bit of time now talking about why we're starting with horticulture. So specifically when we look at the Hort segment, it's fair to argue that this segment has been really underserved in terms of both machine and technological advancement. If we go right back to the 1960s and compare them to how farmers are operating today, not a lot has changed in terms of farming productivity and efficiencies. So where you, if you are a broadacre customer, for example, have been able to see gains in terms of productivity and efficiency by simply accessing faster, more productive machines, bigger, these customers are limited due to the crop type and size, form, scale, and can't have that kind of flexibility where they just simply size up. We also have issues where coverage has been a real challenge when we start to get into some of that precision agriculture and technology adoption space as well. So in terms of our Hort customers, as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, initially our tractor will be targeted to almonds and vineyards. But we do see that will expand rapidly quite quickly. So once we hit 2026, with those crop types, we'll be expanding our reach across other segments as well. And we've already seen that demand, particularly around dairy and livestock customers as well. And I'll talk about some of the benefits that those customers might see from battery electric in that space as well. The last point I wanted to call out really specific to Hort is we know that this industry is very much ready to adopt electric technology. So this data is US based because we have a little bit more challenge trying to get this data pool from Australia, but I think there's some synergies between both markets here. So if we go back to 2017, back then only about 17% of US auto customers were ready to adopt an electric vehicle. If we fast forward to today, which is technically last year because the data is 2022, from the customers that we surveyed within the horticulture industry across the US, 60 to 70% of those customers said that they were ready to purchase an electric offering. So for us, in terms of being successful in this space, it's really important that we target an industry that's not only ready to adopt, but that the solutions align with some of the goals that they're setting for themselves. And we can see that with some of the customers that we work with here in Australia in terms of corporates, where they're setting clear, sustainable targets that are aligned with what we're trying to do here at Deere. So what are the benefits of battery electric? I think as I've worked through these points, you'll start to see some of those synergies that I mentioned earlier across different ag segment applications. But if I start at the top left there, first and foremost, we expect complexity reduction. This is not only in the machine itself, but the components that will make up this machine. This will mean less maintenance costs and downtime for US customers when it comes to battery electric technology. We also anticipate lower cost of ownership and operation. This feeds into the maintenance piece. So while we anticipate that there could be a higher cost of entry, we believe over the life cycle of the machine, that is where customers will start to reap the benefits in terms of total ownership. Obviously, for customers who are setting those sustainability targets, battery electric technology supports our goals around CO2e reduction as well. I'll skip over the technology enablement one and circle back to that. But in terms of favourable regulatory environment, we know that Australia hasn't set those goals just yet, but we do anticipate over time that we'll start to see those kind of requirements come into play, and we want to be ready to make sure we can support our customers on that journey. The other thing when it comes to complexity reduction is it is also expected that battery electric technology will be easier and more intuitive for operation. And that circles back to the point I made earlier around accessing labour, particularly skilled labour. So where we can make machines easier and safer to operate, that's always a win-win for us and our customers. The other piece of battery electric is obviously the noise reduction. And I think this is a really nice one to call out for applications across other segments. So for those of you who are either in dairy or livestock, if you are looking to implement low stress stock handling, noise reduction with your equipment can definitely support that kind of strategy. And finally, particularly within the horsepower segment that we're targeting, which is that 90 to 150 horsepower range, we believe that battery electric technology can deliver effective productivity for the customer and increased reliability as well, so that we can have an efficient use of power there. If I circle back to that bottom point there around technology enablement and scaling, there's 2 points I want to make on this one. Obviously, the electrical infrastructure is going to help us in terms of that scaling of autonomy. And I did say earlier that this tractor would be a fully autonomous battery powered tractor. Now, while I won't spend much time talking around the autonomy piece to that today, because the session's really targeted around electrification, autonomy and autonomous solutions is a big part that is driving this project, and also why we feel that initially horticulture is the right segment to be targeting within this space. So since we announced our strategy last year, I did mention that we received both a lot of positive feedback, but also a lot of questions. We acknowledge that we can't just develop a battery electric tractor and drop it off on your farms and wish you well. We know that we have to deliver a solution that plugs into an entire ecosystem, and we have to consider all of the infrastructure that is required to make this successful. Now, I wouldn't stand here today and tell you that we've got all of this defined perfectly at this stage, and that's where the open communication and collaboration is so critical to the project's success. Currently, we're working with a range of customers and test cooperators, as well as infrastructure providers, to really start to understand what the requirements and expectations are around this machine. Things that we're trying to, I guess, address and make sure that we capture is what is the expectation around runtimes, productivity, is there a trade-off between the two, as well as the specific infrastructure requirements to make this project successful. Where on farm do you need to have power sources, as well as how do we support that charging infrastructure to actually enable this machine to run. So whether that's via charging stations or swappable batteries. Not all of that has been fully defined yet, but that's part of the conversations we're having to make sure that we have a solution that is not only accessible to you, but also feasible. And as we start to define that more specifically for this specific battery powered ag tractor, we'll communicate that openly to the market so that you can start to prepare and have those conversations yourself. So the question on how we're going to bring this solution to market has also been a big one since we announced. Obviously, Deere traditionally has always been in diesel technology, not battery. So what we have done is acquired a majority investment in Kreisel Electric, and the combination of John Deere's technology stack, which forms part of our LEAP ambition, as well as this investment in Kreisel Electric, will position us well to tackle our electrification goals. Kreisel is a leader in innovating and development of high density, high durability electric battery modules and packs, as well as having a supporting charging infrastructure platform that utilizes their patented technology. They have already proven as off-road performance, and we are confident that this technology will help us rapidly scale up in order to deliver this solution by 2026. And no doubt some of you have already seen the unveil at CES earlier this year of our fully battery electric compact digger that we announced there, and that was supported by the Kreisel technology as well. So the last question I'm going to try and anticipate is to acknowledge that we know that not one solution is going to fit every single farming application. There is some limitations in terms of battery electric technology today, and where it's probably going to sit in the next 5 to 10 years in terms of that horsepower range. So we are working around a range of different solutions across renewable fuels as well as hybrid electric solutions that will hopefully have a solution that's more sustainable across every single ag segment that we support. Battery electric will absolutely have a place in certain areas, but it won't be a solution for every single farming application. So we're trying to anticipate that to make sure that we do have solutions that will help you meet your sustainability goals moving forward. So that is everything I had to share today. So I will hand back over to Peter, and I'll have a little bit of a look in that chat box as well to see if I can answer a few questions.
Thanks, Stephanie. That was very in-depth and covered a huge area of your and John Deere's investment sort of ideas for the future. So hopefully people get something out of that and are thinking about their questions. We'll now move on because all questions will be had at the end. I'd like to introduce Ross De Rango. He is the Head of Energy and Infrastructure for the Electric Vehicle Council, which is the peak body representing the electric vehicle sector. Ross's work at EV includes a lot of technical and commercial contribution to tariff designs and demand response architectures. He sits on several standards committee and working groups in these areas. Outside of work, Ross drives a 2014 Outlander PHEV, which I'm not sure what sort of vehicle that is, but I guess it's EV, and he's happy to talk EVs with anybody. So hand over to Ross.
Very good. Thanks, Peter. I'll just make sure that you can hear me and see the screen.
You're a bit echoey, but we can see the screen.
Okay. The echoey, I probably can't do much about it.
No, that's good. That's better. That's better. Lean forward.
Terrific. So Ross De Rango from the Electric Vehicle Council, per Peter's introduction, we're an industry peak body. We represent the car makers, bus makers, truck makers, the energy networks, the charging equipment makers, fleet operators, all sorts of organisations that have a stake in the future involving lots more electric road transport. We're not specifically interested in farming equipment, but there's an awful lot of parallel between things like cars and trucks and things like farming equipment when we look at the electrical infrastructure. So I'm going to talk today about a few topics, and then obviously we'll go to questions. First one is about EVs in Australia. So that green line is the uptake over the last 10, 12 years of electric vehicles in the country. What we've seen is that in the last 2 years, 3/4 of the EVs that are currently on the road have been sold. So last year was 40,000 new EVs got sold in Australia. The year before was 20. The year before was close to 10. We are seeing a really rapid rise in people buying these things and using them. So if you're seeing more Teslas and Polestars getting around, that's not just you, that is everybody, because more of them are coming in. What I've shown on this screen here is the total EV fleet in green, the battery electric vehicle fleet, so it's cars that just have batteries, and then the PHEV, which is plug-in hybrid electric vehicle fleet. The one that I drive is one of the PHEVs in that list of 20,000. Those I'll talk about a bit more in the future, but later in the presentation, but they can plug into the wall, they can also take petrol. To Stephanie's point around, not one solution for everybody. If we compare how we're going to how the rest of the world is going, I've got some country outlines there of percentage of new vehicles sold that are electric. This is a snapshot in time. So if you jump on Google, you'll find numbers that are a little bit different to this based on exactly what time period they're looking at. But in Norway, we're at a point where 90% of the new vehicles sold, this is light vehicles road registered, are electric. In the UK, it's about 20%. In California, it's 15%. In Australia, it's 4%. So we are lagging the rest of the world. We have some of the slowest uptake rate of electric vehicles of anywhere. It would be tempting to suggest that this is because Australians drive long distances. And amongst some cohorts, that might be true. But in the main, our driving behaviour for cars is not much different to these other jurisdictions. Lots of people live in cities. Lots of people occasionally drive out into the country. It's not really the driving needs that's behind that significantly different uptake. What's different is the regulatory settings. So in every other country in the OECD, except us and Russia, there are standards in place that apply to fuel efficiency. These don't apply to an individual car. These apply fleet-wide to the manufacturer or the importer. The way these fuel efficiency standards work is they say for every petrol vehicle you're bringing into the country, you as the importer will pay a penalty. In Europe, the standard penalty for a standard 5 litre per 100 car is $4,000 Australian. For every electric vehicle you bring into the country, you get an offset against those penalties. In 2021, those offsets for each EV amounted to $20,000 Australian. So if you're a vehicle manufacturer and you've got 100,000 petrol vehicles to place in Europe, you are creating for your organisation a $400 million penalty. Bring in 20,000 electric vehicles as well, and you pay no penalty. If you take that limited supply of electric vehicles that you've got at your disposal, though, and you ship them to Australia, you can sell them in Australia just as easily as you can sell them in Europe because demand exceeds supply for EVs everywhere, but you will be exposed to that $400 million penalty in Europe. So what happens is the vehicle OEMs, quite sensibly, send their vehicles to the locations that have the strictest schemes in place. The reason we don't have as many EVs as Australians want to buy is that almost every other jurisdiction has standards in place, has regulations in place that draw the vehicles there instead of here. This is a prime area of work for the Electric Vehicle Council. We've been working with the federal government on this since they won the election, and we have been banging the drum on this issue for a long time. I'll also note that these penalties aren't static. They're not set and forget. These penalties ratchet up over time. So in the UK, it's not going to be legal to sell a new petrol car in 2030. The EU just last week passed a similar ban for 2035. As a country, we need to get our act together and enact similar principles. Otherwise, we just won't get the EVs that people want to drive. Talking a little bit about different types of vehicles. So 4 types that I'm going to talk about on this slide. The first one at the top, internal combustion engine. That's where you've got a petrol or diesel engine and no electric powertrain. So you'll have an electric battery in there to run the starter motor and the ancillaries, but no electricity in the drivetrain. Those have been around for a very, very long time. The majority of people driving vehicles in Australia today are driving those. Mild hybrid electric vehicles, Toyota started selling those in the late 90s. That's the kind of vehicle that does regenerative braking. So when you take your foot off the accelerator and you start coasting, there's a battery system in the drivetrain that will recover some of that energy and then use it to take off. The battery in those are small. There's only 1 or 2 Ks of range in the battery. You can't recharge the battery from the wall. But if you're driving one of those, especially in stop-start traffic, you'll use an awful lot less fuel than you will with the pure combustion engine vehicle. So your run rate might go from 7 litres per 100 down to 5, because the energy you're putting in petrol, you're recovering as electricity and then reusing rather than wasting in brake pads. The next step, plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. Same concept as the mild hybrid, but a much bigger battery to give you 50 to 100 Ks of electric driving range. You've still got the petrol engine for the longer distances, and you can charge them from the wall. So someone who owns one of those will typically plug it in when they get home from work. It'll be set to charge overnight during off-peak time. In the morning, the battery will be full, and the first 50 to 100 Ks they drive that day will be electric, and then it will cut over to the petrol engine. And then pure battery electric vehicle. No petrol engine, no diesel engine in the drivetrain anymore, much, much bigger battery, and the range is however big the battery is. Examples of that are like the Tesla, the Polestar, the F-150 Lightning that I'll talk about later. One of the questions we often get, especially from people who live in regional areas, is what about towing? So same concept applies here to if you're putting a towed asset behind a petrol car. If you tow a big heavy thing, you will use more litres per 100 Ks than if you are not towing. Same applies to batteries. If you take something like a Tesla Model 3 and you don't tow with it, you'll get 400 or 500 Ks of real world range out on freeway driving, interstate driving. If you're towing something that weighs 800 kilos, per this chap in the Canberra Times, your range will drop to about 200 Ks. Depending on what your use case is for towing, that might be all right. If you're towing a trailer load of canoes down to the river for the local scouting group, that's going to be perfectly okay. If you're doing towing interstate though, or if you're taking a boat 400 or 500 Ks to your preferred fishing spot, that's going to be a challenge. The issue isn't that the battery electric vehicles can't tow. They've got the power to do it. The issue is that when you do it, you impact range. So we're anticipating that for people who tow big, heavy things long distances, they're likely to go first to that plug-in hybrid from the pure internal combustion, because on those occasions, when they are doing the towing, that's what the petrol engine is for. Electric utes, conscious that I'm talking to a farming audience, I'm talking to a country audience. Utes are one of the most popular vehicle choices in Australia today, and lots of people are hanging out for when can I buy an electric ute. There's some pictures here of some recent releases by major global manufacturers. That's a Ram, an LDV, and a Ford. If you're looking for really cool videos of these things, jump on the US Super Bowl ads on YouTube. All the car makers now are using the Super Bowl ads as the place to launch their amazing new electric machines. So they are being built. The challenge is that production is only just commencing globally for these sorts of vehicles, and they are not yet at scale. So last year, Ford globally built about 15,000 examples of the F-150 Lightning. That's the pure electric Ford F-150. They're planning to build about 150,000 of those in 2023, this year. The challenge for us as a country, though, is that US domestic demand will account for every unit they're able to produce through till 2024. They're obviously keen to serve their domestic market first, where these things are built. And per my earlier comment around fuel efficiency standards, in the US, there are fuel efficiency standards that apply, and there is a federal tax credit to the tune of 10,000 Australian dollars for an electric vehicle. So they've got schemes in place that will mitigate against many of those vehicles coming here. And we need to match that in legislation and regulation before we could reasonably expect to get large quantities of them. You'll see some of them around, but the question is one of availability. Is one of these available for everybody who wants to buy one? Is the thing we're trying to solve with fuel efficiency standards. And obviously there's price. Putting a big battery in a vehicle tends to make the vehicle more expensive than not putting a big battery in the vehicle. Over time though, prices fall. So I'm using SUVs as an example here because we've got SUV type vehicles in the market in electric over a period of time. If you were shopping for an SUV in 2016, your choice was the Tesla Model X in the range of 120 to 200 grand. Hyundai Kona launched in 2019, 54 to 65K, depending on trim spec. The BYD Atto launched last year, 44K to 48K. 44 to 48 is still more expensive than a base model petrol SUV, but it's an awful lot closer to the mark than 120 to 200. The point that I'm illustrating here is that when the pure electric utes start coming to market, the first ones will be expensive, but they will rapidly fall in price to be not that much different from the high-end spec petrol ones that are already available today. Last slide from me before I throw back to Peter. This is talking about the energy requirements, how we manage the recharging of the assets. And this one will apply, I think, to on-farm equipment just as much as it applies to road-registered equipment. When we drive, we're taking stored energy and we're turning it into movement. So in a typical car, you might get something like 7 litres of petrol per 100 Ks. Varies hugely depending on the type of the car, how you drive, whether you're towing, whether you're using air conditioning. But if we use that as a benchmark example to compare to electricity, it's useful. In electricity, the equivalent to 7 litres of petrol per 100 Ks is 20 kilowatt hours of electrical energy to deliver 100 Ks. So if I'm looking to check this off, kilowatt hours is how much is stored. That's the size of the battery, and it is equivalent roughly to the litres of petrol that I'm using. 20 kilowatt hours matching up with 7 litres. Kilowatts is power. That's how quickly the energy can be transferred out of the battery in order to get acceleration and movement. It's also the measure of how quickly we can put energy into the battery. That's the recharging side. So in recharging rates with cars, the kilowatt number is roughly the number of kilometres of range you will add per 10 or 12 minutes you plug it in. In something like a Tesla Model 3 or a Polestar, if you plug into a standard domestic power point, you'll get on the order of 120 to 150 Ks of range top up overnight. For an awful lot of drivers, that's enough, which is showing in the outcomes of many, many people buying EVs aren't installing charging equipment, they're just plugging into the 10 amp power point. For people who want more than that, you can install a standard EV charger in the 7 to 11 kilowatt range. Cost of installing one of those in a home is typically $2,000 to $3,000. Those will fully recharge any EV on the market overnight because the battery size in the EV is maybe 70 or 80 kilowatt hours. So a power of 7 to 11 means 8 to 10 hours and it's full. And then you've got fast chargers. So take a big, thick 3-phase supply, turn 3-phase AC into DC at really high power. And the upper limit is how much energy can the battery absorb in a period of time and what is the size of the supply. The fastest recharging cars on the market today are the Porsche Taycans. In one of those, you can put 200 Ks of range into them in 6 or 7 minutes. Most car makers aren't building quite that much capability into their cars because it's expensive to do it. For most car makers, if you turn up at a 350 kilowatt charger, it'll take you something like 15 minutes to add 200 Ks of range. But that gives you an idea of how long you will be stopped if you are doing, for example, the drive from Melbourne to Sydney and you want to stop in Albury. That drive is going to look like a couple of 15, 20-minute stops. I would argue that while it's possible to drive Melbourne to Sydney in one hop, if you're doing it without stopping, you're doing it wrong. That's a drive where you really should be stopping for 15, 20 minutes a couple of times for rest breaks. Sorry, last slide, and this is more a thought prompter. People often ask me about hydrogen and where it fits. For cars, hydrogen fuel cell can't compete. Hydrogen fuel cell cars are electric cars, but you are replacing the battery with a tank full of hydrogen and a fuel cell, which is the machine for turning the hydrogen into electricity. The reason they can't compete for cars is that electricity is already available in everyone's garage. The infrastructure is already built. And if you start with electricity to make hydrogen, and then you take the hydrogen and turn it back into electricity in the car, you lose 2/3 of the energy on the way in those transformations. So battery electric is about 3 times more efficient, therefore 3 times cheaper to run. There may be cases where long haul trucks and possibly some of the heaviest farming equipment, hydrogen might be a fit for. But we're kind of yet to see that one shake out in industry. It's an uncertain space with various interests pushing it in various ways. That's it for my slides. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll pass back to Peter.
Thanks, Ross. That was very informative. Now, I've got a few questions here, if I just get them up. One of the first, if I can find it, Stephanie, was Andrew Burgess was worrying about or thinking about the olive industry. Are you talking to them in your developments? Over?
Yeah, we have had some limited conversations. As I said, initially the focus is around the almond and vineyard applications, but as we get closer to that 2026 launch date, that's when we're going to start to expand out to other applications. We've also had quite a bit of interest from citrus as well. So those are the kind of, I guess, parallel segments that we'll start to branch out to make sure that the application is suitable.
Very good. I'll give one to Ross here. This is a fairly important question from Joe. What is the EV Council doing regards advocacy for shifting regulations and standards for V2G and V2X? I'm not too sure what that means, but
yeah.
I have just purchased a Nissan Leaf, which has a bi-directional battery and can be part of our home farm battery storage when this regulation hurdle is overcome.
Yeah, so I'll clarify first what the question's about. V2G is vehicle to grid, V2X is vehicle to anything, and it is the idea that you can take the stored electricity in the battery in the vehicle and use it for something other than driving the vehicle. The idea is getting the electricity back out and using it to support the farmhouse, for example, during a power outage, or to run equipment that might be plugged in to the vehicle out in the field. There are very strict standards in place around solar inverters. I imagine a lot of people on this call have got solar on their homes already and have an inverter on the wall. There's a set of standards in AS 4777 that covers solar inverters. That standard applies to vehicle to grid, but it has not been written for vehicle to grid. And it is a standard that is currently being reviewed in order to make it more suitable for vehicle to grid. To the question of what is the EVC doing, we are in the standards committee making those changes. It'll be a couple of years before that is effective. In the time in between, if you want to install the vehicle to grid charger, the person supplying it needs to get sign off from the local energy network. If you're in South Australia, that will be straightforward. If you're anywhere else, it will be difficult.
Very good. Now, one for Steph, and I don't know if she can answer this one because basically she's talking about electric vehicles, but where did it go? Here we go. Stephen wanted to know whether John Deere was exploring green hydrogen like JCB in the UK. Are you doing any hydrogen work?
I can't speak specifically to, I guess, those projects that I'm not involved in, but we are looking at a range of different solutions. So we're sort of exploring anything that looks feasible to really test that. And like I said on my last slide, we do acknowledge that, you know, it's not going to be a one solution fits all. So battery electric will serve some customers, and then there will be some customers where some of these other alternative or renewable fuel sources will suit better. So unfortunately, I can't give you too much detail on that one, but I can guarantee you we'll be looking into it.
Okay, and here's an interesting marketing one for you. from Graham, given the battery technology is evolving rapidly and the support systems likewise, what sort of incentives do you plan to provide early adopters? I'd certainly be expecting some significant incentives given my experience with ag EVs and early solar PV systems in the early 2000s. You have a view on that, Steph?
So I guess from our side, when we, maybe if I start with the launch timelines and how we're gonna scale up, that will hopefully answer that to some degree. When we launch in 2026, obviously our initial production will be limited and that will be offered to our test cooperators in the first instance because they're partnering with us throughout the whole process. So that's where those incentives will sit. Then when we'll look at early adopters, we'll obviously be looking at how financially we can support that adoption as well, but there is always a trade-off there and we're probably too early in the project to set some specific, I guess, incentives and financial, I guess, goals around that. But we'll definitely be looking at how we can support early adopters.
Very good. One for Ross from Om Jahar. Hi, Om. Can hydrogen replace petrol? You've sort of covered it a little bit.
Yeah, so it's an interesting area that if you're looking at hydrogen as a replacement fuel, hydrogen can be used through a fuel cell to make electricity. And if you use hydrogen in that mode, you get electrical energy out and you get water vapor out. So provided you haven't created a heap of CO2 in the creation of the hydrogen, it's relatively clean as a solution. It doesn't emit CO2. You start with renewable electricity and water, split the water into hydrogen and oxygen. The hydrogen becomes your fuel and it turns back into water after you've used it. It's less efficient than just using electricity directly, but in some cases it'll fit well. If, as an alternative, you take the hydrogen and combust it in an internal combustion engine, burning hydrogen in the presence of nitrogen, which is 80% of the air we breathe, creates nitrous oxides. Nitrous oxides, like CO2, are a greenhouse forcing gas. So there's an argument there in favour of, if you're going to use hydrogen, the right way to do it is to use the hydrogen to make electricity. Otherwise, you're just producing large volumes of a different greenhouse forcing gas. Hopefully that makes sense and I'm not going too much sciencey and chemistry.
No, and I'm just reading in the chat. I think Joe would be pleased with that answer as well. Now I have a question here for Steph from Anthony. It's about, I guess, small orchard tractors. He has a fleet of 15 tractors. How can we charge them at night? We do not have enough electricity coming in from the grid. Are the tractors plug-in or will they have battery packs?
Yeah, fantastic question. So firstly, what I would say is we haven't fully defined exactly what the final solution will look like. More likely than not, it will be a charging station, but those sort of things are still being defined and we haven't ruled out having options around that as well. In terms of charging overnight, if your infrastructure currently wouldn't necessarily support that, that is the big piece of the puzzle that we do need to solve and also be really transparent of how we go along that journey to help you prepare. Most likely customers, particularly those early adopters, are going to have to invest in infrastructure upgrades to support this solution. There's no way around that realistically, and that will have a financial investment attached to that as well. But our job as Deere, as we start to define that, is to communicate that really transparently with you to make sure that you've got all the information to make those decisions and prepare to adopt if you feel that the financial investment will be worthwhile for your business.
I might jump in on that one as well, if I could, Peter. So that question of when acquiring an electric vehicle of any kind, whether it's a piece of farm machinery, whether it's a mower, whether it's an electric car, the question of what do you need to do on the electrical infrastructure side to make ready for it is important. If you're in a standalone home and you've got 1 or 2 electric cars, there's typically no need to upgrade the supply to the home. What you need to do is make sure that the car is not charging at the same time as all the other high power electrical assets. So if we imagine a future where people have got 2 electric cars in the garage and an induction cooktop and an air conditioner, they can do all of the charging of the cars that's needed at times when the air conditioner and the induction cooktop aren't running full tilt, and there's no need to upgrade. The question is one of, when does energy need to be put into that vehicle in order for the vehicle to meet the use case of the person? So for example, if we think about a mower electric that might be used by local government, Those are available in the market now with 8 hours of cutting time and 8 hours of recharging time. So it spends 8 hours out in the field cutting. Overnight, it's parked in the garage, plugged into a power point, and it's full the next day. Getting the battery sizing and the recharging rate right and understanding the consumer's use case, that's the key for figuring out what infrastructure changes might be needed to support it.
Very good. Well, that leads into another question here from Sally, and a few other people are interested in what's available and how they work, how they charge them, I guess, of the smaller farm vehicles like ATVs and side-by-sides and ride-on mowers and that sort of thing. Either of you like to take that question?
I might defer to Steph on that one. I'm not sure of the breadth of vehicles available. She's probably closer to it than me.
Yeah, for sure. So I mentioned in my presentation, we're obviously going to have multiple battery electric offerings across that smaller portfolio. And we've already announced out of the US last year, our electric Z-Track, which is a zero-turn solution. So that is currently not a swappable battery. That is a charging like plug-in solution today. So the run times on that have been quite good, with customers reporting being able to do sort of 10 to 12 hours of mowing, which is much more than a domestic use would normally require there as well. So that is currently what the solutions on the market are delivering, but I can't speak for every supplier.
Very good. Now, one for Ross, I would think. People are inquiring about the second-hand market and what you might expect to happen there.
Sure. So we know right now, if you're in the market for a new EV, they're higher priced than petrol cars of equivalent trim spec, right? Unless you're shopping way up in the top end range. Fostering EVs being available for a broad cohort of the Australian market, it's important that we foster a second-hand market in these things. The second-hand market for affordable EVs currently is really small. So as an exercise, if you want to understand it, I did this a couple of weeks ago. Jump on car sales and have a look at all cars available for sale, and you'll get about 200,000. Put in a filter of $30,000 and you'll chop them in half. You'll get about 100,000 for sale. Put in a filter of just the EVs below $30,000 and you might see 25 cars, right? It's a really small market. And that's because in the last 2 years, 3/4 of the EVs on Australian roads have been sold. All these cars are still in the hands of their first owners. They haven't reached the second-hand market yet. Fostering the second-hand market fast looks like supporting the fleets that turn those vehicles over into the second-hand market quickly. So that's people like airport rental fleets. If you look at Hertz or Europcar or 6T, any of the folks at the airport, they buy new cars and turn them over into the second-hand market within 12 months. So if we want a robust second-hand market quickly, it's the airport fleets, the Uber fleets, the taxi fleets, the people who buy a new car and 12 to 18 months later, it's in the second-hand market. That's where we have some work to do. And that is an area of advocacy for our organisation.
Very good. I've got a question for Steph. What is the sort of limits on tractor size, horsepower that battery EVs could be expected in the future? Do you think there's a limit, or what is the story?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and probably circles back to the comment around not one solution will fit all. So currently, as the technology stands today, we are confident that we can deliver a really efficient battery electric tractor that will serve, where we traditionally sit between 90 to 150 horsepower. And we're obviously wanting to make sure that it meets and exceeds customer expectations, so the power output's going to sit a little bit higher than that. That really is where we feel that it cuts out in terms of efficiency, in terms of weight, cost of entry, and all the other pieces there in terms of job application. That's not to say in the future that you can't expand beyond that, but that's really where we're focusing a fully battery electric solution. Once we start moving up to those higher horsepower units, so we were looking at 200 plus horsepower, that's really where we start to look at some of the alternative solutions that we're investigating. So that could look in the forms of renewable fuel sources, hybrid technology, electrical components that Ross even talked about in the car industry. It's no different to some of the things we're doing at Deere and Ag with our eIVT, so electrically driven transmission and things like that. So I would say around 150 is where we feel that it caps out today, but that's not to say that won't expand in the future.
Right, and another question here about your plans? So for John Deere having a supply in 2026, does that mean in America or does that mean in Australia? And whatever it means, will you have demonstration vehicles on display before then?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it probably does feed a little bit into some of the comments Ross made around domestic demand over in the US where it's being manufactured versus us, particularly where we don't have regulation. One thing I would say about this project is we are partnering with the US very closely, so that's why we have Australian customers involved from the very start who will be testing the unit. So we do anticipate that we will have units down here in Australia as full production in 2026. They will be obviously limited numbers, and yes, the plan would absolutely be have demonstration units for customers to come and check out, and that will support some of the early adopters who perhaps weren't part as our test partners throughout the process.
Very good. Now I've got a bit of a blue sky question for Ross. This will be interesting from Pamela. She wants to know where he sees a future for domestic production of EVs. Bring back the car industry.
Yep. Okay. So I'll go with disclosure. I'm an Australian who grew up in Bannockburn and Geelong, not far from the Ford manufacturing facility. I look on the way we handle our natural resources as a country, right? We dig a lot of stuff out of the ground and we ship it with a minimum amount of refining, a minimum amount of value add. There is certainly a case to be made for it being good for our country to have more economic strings to our bow, right? So the idea of could we build EVs in this country? Absolutely we could. We build buses in this country. We build trucks in this country. We build trams, trains in this country. There's no reason we couldn't build cars. It's the economic settings around enabling it. We are essentially in competition with every other country in the world that wants to jump in on this as to the degree to which we're going to support an organisation that wants to build cars here. Because if we have car manufacturing here and they're electric cars, we will also end up with battery manufacture here, which will mean the lithium, nickel, manganese supply chain ends up getting all sorts of value add done to it, creating Australian jobs. There is an industry already in retrofitting existing petrol cars, changing them over to electric. That already exists here. Part of the advocacy work we do is around exactly that. Can we have more vehicle manufacture in this country, not just vehicle importation?
Very good. Now I've got the usual question which comes up a bit from Andrew. I'm curious about safety aspects of lithium batteries and in the farming context. Given their propensity to catch fire and the difficult to extinguish when damaged, what considerations have been given to the aspects of safety as EVs make their way onto farms?
I'm happy to speak to that one first, unless Steph would like to jump in.
No, I think Ross, you could tackle that one first, and then I can speak specifically to Deere.
No worries at all. So I guess the starting point is that battery electric vehicles don't catch fire more frequently than petrol vehicles. They catch fire less often because they're less complicated. There's less stuff in there to actually go wrong. When a battery electric vehicle burns, if the battery catches, and it's often the case that the vehicle goes and the battery doesn't, but if the battery catches, it takes longer to extinguish typically, it may require more water. So considerations around how the firefighters are going to engage with it is important, ensuring that the firefighters are appropriately trained, as they would respond to any vehicle fire, breathing apparatus, because whether it's a petrol diesel car burning or an electric car burning, you don't want to breathe in the products of combustion. But I think this is an area where there's an awful lot more fear, uncertainty, and doubt being sown than there is actual evidence. If you're interested in diving into the detail on it, the EVC recently made a submission to the ACCC investigation into lithium-ion battery safety. That's up on our website under submissions. Encourage people curious about this one to, I guess, start their journey there.
Steph, have you got anything to add on that or not?
Probably just echo Ross's comments around the true risk around that. And then in terms of John Deere, any new product development goes through the same robust safety and compliance evaluation. We do not launch a product that is green and yellow with a Deere badge on it without having met every possible safety requirement for every region that we export to. So you know, it's no different. While it is maybe potentially some different technology and different components, it's no different to the process that we would apply to any product to make sure that we're assuring our customers' safety. So it's always front and foremost in our minds as we develop these, but we don't see it any differently. We have to deliver a high-performing, reliable machine that's safe for you to operate.
Very good. We're getting close to 1 o'clock, but I've got a few more questions. One here from Andrew. Are there any thoughts in setting universal standards for swap over batteries? So I guess either of you could answer that. Who wants to go first? Probably Steph, because she's in the industry.
Look, there's definitely been some conversations where even between the US and Australia, just comparing where standards currently sit and the synergies there. You know, even before the webinar started, we were talking about some of the opportunities we have as manufacturers to collaborate in these spaces. I think it's something that will be looked at much more closely as we progress with battery technology. Like you've seen how much has exploded in handheld tools. No doubt it's coming to other equipment as well. So that's something that we'll be actively looking at, but nothing too specific to share just yet. So I might let Ross tackle that one because it looks like he's keen to.
Thank you kindly. Yeah, I'll go with that one. Very much depends on the vehicle use case. So if you're talking about a consumer's car, the location where they want that fast recharge, that fast refill, is typically going to be either at a suburban shopping centre because they're charging there on account of not being able to charge at home, or it's going to be at like a public location on a freeway somewhere between towns because they're going a long distance. For car makers to standardise on exactly the same design of battery and exactly the same mechanism of inserting and removing at high speed 400 or 500 kilos of asset from a vehicle is a really, really difficult ask. There would need to be a massive degree of standardisation of wheelbase, suspension, vehicle design that would limit the choices that manufacturers would have when they're designing vehicles. So while it's very, very possible for an individual manufacturer to design a battery swapping system, designing something that will work at scale across all manufacturers is really hard. If I think about the farm context though, if you're talking about a battery swapping arrangement for a tractor that stays on the farm, and the reason for the battery swapping is so that you can do 6 hours of work, come back to the shed, change the battery and do another 6 hours of work, that's very, very different from the consumer car in terms of its use. So it might work there in a way that it wouldn't work for the people at Polestar and Volvo, for example.
And I think we'll make this the final question. It comes from Tyrone, and it's sort of looking to the future. If people are looking to move into renewable infrastructure, so in their homes or whatever else, what sort of rules of thumb should they look at if they're thinking of putting an EV car into the plan as well?
So I'll go with, when you're sizing the infrastructure in your home for an EV, you need to understand how much energy needs to be delivered and when. And once you know that, then you can work out what the size of the connection needs to be and what potentially the size of the available solar resources could be. If we're thinking about a typical car, average driving of 50 kilometres a day for an average consumer, right? Which is probably not the folks on this call. People on this call probably drive more than average. But if you're driving 50 Ks a day, you need 10 kilowatt hours each day of energy to serve that, which means something like a 5 kilowatt solar system will deliver that much energy or more every day if the car's parked when the sun's shining. It really does come down to what are you trying to power and when are you trying to recharge it before you can say with certainty, this is the connection arrangement I need.
Thanks, Ross. Have you got anything to add on that, Steph? Probably not. Or maybe.
Maybe as an extension to that, so I didn't see it come up, but it has been quite topical from my side, is around the cost, so price of entry as we start to bring these products to market. So I guess just a couple of comments around that, because I'm sure people are thinking about it. What we anticipate, and Ross did touch on this, is the cost of battery electric technology will continue to go down. So that's great for that initial investment. But the other thing that I'd really encourage you all to think about, particularly if that battery electric ag tractor is something you feel would be suitable for your property, is to start having those conversations and thinking about, where that initial cost of investment is going to sit versus what your goals as an operation currently are and where they're going to sit in the future, to really understand that total cost of ownership piece. The electrical infrastructure is one component of that, but there is some other things to think about as well. So that's probably just something I'd want to add in there.
All right, and with that, I'd like to thank our panelists today, and been a very educational and interesting discussion. There will be an email sent out for all the attendees so that you can link into the recording that will be on the website. And for those that are interested, we'll probably be running, in fact, we will be running more webinars on various subjects in this area in the future. So keep your eye out and we'll keep you informed. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for attending. We've had quite a big roll up and it's been very interesting. Thank you.